Recently, the site Forest of Illusion released a prototype of a Game Boy Advance port of Quake. Watch out for the Shambler, and let's check it out. Hopefully, this video doesn't need much of an introduction for Quake, id Software's follow-up to the Doom franchise, a fully 3D first-person shooter that has the player fighting gothic horrors once again trying to take over the Earth. Much like Doom, it was developed for PCs, but eventually it was released on plenty of platforms, including the Nintendo 64, as shown here. This newly released prototype was being worked on by John Linden, who famously was the developer of the entire Doom port for the Super Nintendo under Sculptured Software. That port famously was built from the ground up using a different engine and was a feat that id Software did not think was possible. It's a fun port that has been talked about to death, but is an interesting part of video game history. So in 2002, Linden thought he would do something else likely thought impossible and started porting Quake to the Game Boy Advance. There were several first-person shooter games on the GBA already, such as Doom and Doom 2, so it isn't like the entire concept of an FPS on the little handheld was completely unheard of. But something like Quake, despite being 6 years old at this point, would have been a heavy task for the modest handheld. This prototype has no real attachment to Quake, outside of general aesthetic and some early gameplay mechanics. Linden had not reached out to id at this point, only developing the engine and tech to see if it was even possible. So upon booting the game, you're just dropped into a random map that certainly looks like Quake, but that's about it. Enemies are these placeholder spider-looking things that don't attack unless you attack them first, and while there are weapons and items throughout the level, they are mostly for show. You can't seem to pick up the armor, for example. But most importantly, you can explore and get a feeling of the movement and mechanics, and they feel pretty authentic for Quake. The greatest thing about this prototype is how much of a 3D engine it is. There appears to be actual 3D modeling compared to something like Doom or Wolfenstein 3D, which utilizes 2D sprites for a large majority of the design. As you run and jump around the level, you can even do things like swim and go underwater. The prototype includes 3 maps. You can use some debugging controls to move through them, either booting up while holding left or holding the right trigger, or you can just press either one after death. The 3rd map shows some really interesting geometry when many of the floors and platforms are twisted and sloped. This would have been mind-blowing on the Game Boy Advance. The lighting is different too when compared to something like Doom, especially the one on the Game Boy Advance, which just uses flat lighting and even removes any ambient lighting or real darkness at all. To be fair, this was mostly done to make it possible to even see the levels on the original non-backlit GBA screen, but it's impressive to see some of the beginnings of lighting effects for this port of Quake. According to Forest of Illusion, it is using point lighting and a palette changing effect for pre-rendered objects. I think the thing that impressed me the most was how smooth the game controls were. Insanely smooth, honestly, for not only the hardware, but the D-pad controls. Even better was using the joystick on the GameCube controller. It felt like it was almost designed with that possibility in mind. I don't notice any difference in it compared to playing a full console FPS release from the time. This coupled with what feels like a rather stable frame rate, and this makes for an enjoyable experience. The rest of the controls are unsurprising and of course majorly simplified like other GBA FPS ports. In this version, you have jump and shoot with strafing mapped to the shoulder buttons. Aiming is automatic, and unlike Doom, you can actually see your gun move to the enemy. I couldn't find any other combos to do anything like switch weapons. I imagine if this game had made it further along, the other needed controls would have been set to pressing 2 buttons at once or just push to the pause menu. Interacting with the environment in Quake usually needed a shot from a gun or just walking to it, so I doubt that wouldn't have remained. They did a similar thing in Duke Nukem Advance. Opening doors and activating switches just required walking to them, and switching weapons required pressing both shoulder buttons. But it seems like the prototype doesn't actually have any working weapons besides the shotgun and grenade launcher anyway. Even when I would grab other weapons like an axe or what looked like a machine gun of some sort, the game would have just given me the grenade launcher again. Plus the enemies aren't exactly fun to fight anyway. The yellow spiders don't seem to be any threat even after firing at them, and the blue spiders are really overpowered. It was fun trying to see if I could grenade a blue spider before it even got the chance to fire at me though. This port of Quake would have easily been the most impressive first-person shooter on the Game Boy Advance, had it ever made it out. This even has a very strong showing when it comes to music and sound, despite just using stock music. The prototype was far from silent compared to some other games it would have been competing against. Duke Nukem Advance and X vs. Sever were probably the other most advanced FPS games on the GBA prior to this prototype. Duke Nukem Advance is a really well-made FPS for the system, but a bit on the boring side, and the silence in the levels absolutely does not help. It still lives in that Doom world, much more than the build engine that it originally came from. Corridors, square rooms, 2D enemy sprites, and like the port of Doom on the GBA, lighting is basically non-existent. Again, this may have been out of design choice for the GBA screen, but there still isn't any fun accent lighting either. Level design is still strong though, and it is a fun experience. This is not Duke 3D, and is sort of original to the system, different engine, and new story, but using assets from Duke Nukem 3D. X vs. Sever was completely developed for the Game Boy Advance, and despite being a well-crafted FPS experience for the handheld, it also suffers from some of the same issues. It feels like Wolfenstein 3D, but with a few new touches. Very flat lighting with empty rooms and corridors, also ridiculously silent, and some of the sound effects are a bit wishy-washy. That doesn't mean it's a bad game. That's probably a discussion for another time though, but this Quake Prototype blows it out of the water. It is honestly unfortunate this game never came out on the Game Boy Advance, but apparently at this point of development was reached, the GBA was on its way out. I would assume then we're already talking about 2004 or 2005, and the DS is already taking off. It could have easily been a late GBA release gem. The system popularity was still surprising in 05 and 06, and the DS of course had backwards compatibility anyway. But the amount of work left here probably wouldn't have justified a little hidden gem title it might have been. John Linden did eventually release the game though in 2019 just on Amazon Fire and other Android devices, changing the name to Cyboid and moving forward with the very Quake-inspired level design featuring arachnid-style monsters. It looks to have microtransactions but has the option for touch or Bluetooth controls. I don't have any way to load this game up to try it, but would have probably had a great time looking at the footage made available from the R&R Digital YouTube page. Honestly, it's free to get playing, so if you have a device, you should load it up. I encourage everyone to go read a bit more about this prototype on the Forest of Illusion website and download the prototype. Throw it on Everdrive and check it out for a few minutes, just to see what could have been. Especially if you're a big Quake fan. Just temper your expectations, there is only so much there. Links will be in the description. That's all from me and this episode of RetroActive. Let me know if you've ever checked the prototype out, and as always, I'll see you next time. Hey, this is Kevin. Once again, thanking you so much for watching another episode of RetroActive. If you liked it, please hit that like button, subscribe, leave a comment, all the stuff I'm supposed to say. And I also want to remind you that I do have a Ko-fi account and a Discord. Links will be in the description. Bye.